Kia ora and welcome to Baha'i On Air. I'm Bev Watson. In this episode we will be featuring part 2 of our two-part series about the persecution of the Baha'is in Iran, why it began and how it continues. In the first episode we explained that the persecution of the Baha'is began in 1844 at the very inception of the Baha'i faith because Baha'is are regarded as heretics and infidels. In the early days, more than 20,000 people were killed because of their beliefs, and the persecution continues to this day. We mentioned the Golpagani Memorandum, a secret document produced by the Iranian government which sets out a policy calling for the progress and development of the Baha'is to be blocked, and the action taken at the United Nations by a number of governments calling for the Baha'is in Iran to be accorded the same human rights as other Iranian citizens. We stated that the Baha'i faith constitutes the largest religious minority in Iran, but is not protected under the Iranian constitution, which recognizes only Christianity, Judaism, and of course Islam. We also stated that the Baha'i faith recognizes the divine origins of Islam and accepts Muhammad as a revealer of the divine word. Nevertheless, the persecution of the Baha'is continues.
Only my hope is that I hope he was not tortured.
In this episode, we will be speaking with Iranian Bahá'ís now living in Australasia. They will tell the stories of how their family members were imprisoned, tortured, executed, or simply disappeared in the early 1980s at the height of the Iranian Revolution. Two of these interviewees requested to be recorded in silhouette in order to protect family members still living in Iran. What impact did the revolution in Iran and the persecution of the Baha'is have on your own family?
Well, the Iranian Revolution has impacted my greater family, starting from my uncle, my father, my mother, my brother, sister, and nieces and nephews, right to the stage of today. They are still under persecution in one way or another.
Can you tell us about your father?
My father was a university-trained government employee, and he worked for the government of Iran for 30 years. But not very long from his retirement, to begin with, his pension was cut off. And within a very short period of time, his house was invaded by the Revolutionary Guard, and his life and belonging, everything was confiscated, and he was taken to prison. He was in prison for over 7 months, during which he was tortured and he was severely ill, and later on he was executed alongside with another number of Baha'is of the same city.
Can you tell us about your father?
He was a prominent television personnel in Iran, and he pioneered the program for youth and children. Also, he was an educator and an author.
An author?
Yeah.
Tell us about your father's disappearance.
Well, the National Spiritual Assembly, the 9 members, they had a meeting, and they were just arrested, and after that we had no news from him.
So at the meeting, the guards came and took away all 9 members of the National Spiritual Assembly?
Yes, plus the other 2, there was 2 extra people they took as well. And the Baha'is tried to find out where they are and to see them as a prisoner or which prison they went in, but the authorities absolutely denied that they have any news from them. Right. Only my hope is that I hope he was not tortured.
So I guess after so many years of hearing absolutely nothing, the presumption is that he is dead.
The year after they got my father, my mother became a member of National Spiritual Assembly. Later on we find out that she was executed, and so we sort of figure out that if they didn't keep the first one, the second one, the first one will probably have been executed. As well. They wouldn't just keep them for a very long time.
Whither can a lover go but to the land of his beloved? seeker findeth rest away from his heart's desire to the true lover.
Perhaps you could explain why the Baha'i Institute of Higher Education was set up.
It was set up by the Baha'is in Iran to provide higher education for the young people who were not allowed to go to universities on the grounds that they are Baha'is. In a lot of cases they were doing degrees such as medical, dentistry, and a lot of other higher education that otherwise they wouldn't be able to get it. Computer studies.
How was this done?
This was done by the Baha'is for the Baha'i youth. All the university professors or well-educated Baha'is who were not able to work, they were able to provide classes, lessons. And they were not aware even that they shouldn't be doing it. It's not as if it was forbidden. They weren't forbidden to do that. They were forbidden to attend university, but they weren't forbidden to gain knowledge at home privately. So you're involved in an activity not knowing that you're not supposed to be doing it, and as a result of that being arrested, you can imagine what a shock that would be to even people involved who are conditioned to persecution.
And also, Baha'is are obliged to be obedient to the government of the country in which they live.
That's true.
What can you tell us about the arrests?
Most of the people who were involved were taken in. Some of them were kept anything from a week to a month and even longer in prison. The teaching material, the equipments such as computers and other learning equipments were confiscated, and they were all asked to stop this activity. And based on that, they were released.
My mother was a scientist. She was the director of meteorology in Iran. She also had a lot to do with, they sort of created an atlas for Iran. After revolution, she was fired, and then she was even asked to give the money back. For the last 25 years, she was working for them.
And she was told directly that she was being fired because she was a Baha'i.
Yes.
They did?
Yes.
They flat out, that was it?
Yes. They were telling her that she has no right to be in the government, yes.
In a moment, we'll return to our interviews with Iranian Bahá'ís now living in New Zealand as they tell how the persecution in Iran has affected their lives. Bahá'ís in Iran continue to be denied access to jobs, pensions, tertiary education and state services solely because of their beliefs. They may not inherit from Muslim relatives. Homes and livelihoods may be confiscated and destroyed. They may be arrested and imprisoned without trial in an effort to compel them to recant and convert to Islam. However, Baha'is are not in any way anti-Iran and must be obedient to the government of the country in which they live. While Baha'is continue to call for justice, both for themselves and others, they hold no grudge against those who perpetrate injustice against them. And now we return to our interview with Iranian Bahá'ís now living in Australasia. What exactly happened when your mother was arrested?
It was the same story almost. They had to have a meeting. And after the meeting, before they left the house, the troop arrived and they took them. They emptied their bags, they blindfolded them and took them. And she was for a couple of weeks in the prison.
Was she able to have visitors in that time?
I have a little story, inside story, because one of the ladies who was with her was freed. So she told me that this 1 week what happened to her was in the prison, how was the condition of the prison. The second week they took them somewhere else, blindfolded her and freed the other lady. And so they went, for second week I have no news, I don't know what really happened. And then without any trial she was executed.
So they were all arrested,
Yes.
sentenced without trial, and then they were all executed.
Yes.
The Baha'is featured in these interviews tell the stories of how their family members were imprisoned, tortured, executed, or simply disappeared in the early 1980s at the height of the Iranian Revolution. For more recent events in Iran, though, I spoke with David Warren, a member of the New Zealand Baha'i community, about what is currently happening. In recent times, the persecution of the Baha'is in Iran has become quite a lot worse in a number of different ways. Could you tell us something about the things that have been happening?
In October 2005, the chairman of the command headquarters of the armed forces wrote a letter conveying specific instructions from Ayatollah Khamenei. Now that letter was sent to a number of government agencies. It was sent to the Ministry of Information, to the commander of the Revolutionary Guard, and to the commander of the police force. Well, that in itself is quite concerning, but how do we know that these activities and instructions are being carried out? Well, in February 2006, we learned that the Iranian Associations of the Chambers of Commerce, this is a governing body for all chambers of commerce in Iran, that organization was compiling a list of Baha'is who were engaged in every type of trade and employment, identifying them specifically as being members of the Baha'i community, and that was starting to create problems for the Baha'is. Now, furthermore, one of the societies, a trade, production and technical services society, issued specific instructions also to a union. This was in May of 2006, requesting that union to gather further information about the Baha'is. Now that would be of great concern, even more so enforcing the fact that there was going to be the gathering of this information, that it was occurring. It's particularly alarming and of particular concern in an environment where the government is so clearly hostile to the Baha'i community.
This instruction from the Ayatollah came in the midst of a major anti-Baha'i campaign in state-controlled media, did it not?
Correct. This began in October 2005. There were a series of articles, dozens of articles in the state-run media, the newspaper, the Keha newspaper, then television and radio broadcasts, clearly designed to incite the general population against the Baha'i community. There were outrageous claims such as that the Baha'is on Muslim holy days would sacrifice a Muslim child, consume alcohol and dance. Anyone that has any understanding of the Baha'i community knows that this is patently untrue. And the only conclusion that we can draw from that, it's clearly designed to incite anti-Baha'i activity.
There has also been an escalation in the number of incidents in which Baha'is are being personally harassed too.
Correct. Baha'i households have been receiving notes, texts, even CDs, messages to their cell phones, personal cell phones, SMS messages, clearly designed to refute the claims of the Baha'i faith and furthermore to vilify the Baha'i faith. One of the techniques that has been used is to associate the Baha'is and the Baha'i community very closely with the United States of America. This plays on the anti-American sentiment that exists in Iran.
And the number of Baha'is in Iran who have been arrested has increased quite dramatically lately too.
And certainly we've seen some of the biggest incidents since the 1980s in recent times. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Housing confirmed this from an independent point of view, that the number of arrests, particularly of Baha'i leaders and prominent Baha'is, had increased significantly. In May of 2006, some 54 Baha'is were arrested in Shiraz. Now these were youth who were conducting lawful activities. They were providing education to underprivileged children. They had a permit from the government to do this. They were arrested and they were held without bail for 5 days. This is tragic. You try to be obedient, you gain the permits necessary, you hold these permits, and yet you're arrested without bail for no reason at all. And this is a photograph of 3 of those youth from Shiraz.
And the Special Rapporteur had some comment to say about the number of Baha'is being arrested.
Correct. The Special Rapporteur from the United Nations, this was the Rapporteur on Housing in Iran, made a specific comment to the extent that the Baha'is of prominence and Baha'i leaders in the community were being increasingly arrested without cause.
You are one of the Baha'is now living in New Zealand whose family members were executed in Iran after the revolution. Your father was one of those people.
Yes, he was. He was a member of local Baha'i assembly, and he was executed along with other members of the assembly.
Before we go into details about that, can you tell us a little bit about your father? What was his occupation?
He was a high school teacher, but at the time he was retired.
And your father was taken away with other members of the assembly. Can you tell us exactly what happened?
My father had received a letter saying that we want you to come to the courts at such and such date, and he went himself, and he knew that that meant that never coming back.
So he knew that by going he was going to be imprisoned, but he went anyway.
He did, yes.
Why would he do that?
In a way you could say it was to shield the community from further harm, as if they were representatives. It seemed as though they wanted to teach a lesson to the community, or frighten them, or do something to stop their activities. And the assembly members knew that if they went, that meant that they would be in prison. Of course, you're always hopeful that the truth will come out and they will become reasonable and release the people, because they had done no crime, they hadn't done anything wrong, and by proving that, you're hopeful that you'll be released.
But what actually happened?
They were kept for many months, during which time all they were asked to do was to recount their faith.
Recant their faith.
And if they did that, they would be released. But if they didn't, they were threatened that they would be killed and their families would be harmed and their possessions would be confiscated. Despite all that, none of them recounted.
And then what happened?
Then they were all executed.
In 1953, an extremist Shiite cleric established an organization called the Hujjatiyya Society. Now, this was disbanded in 1983, having conducted in the interim period of 30-odd years a clearly antagonistic and anti-Baha'i activity. In fact, its fundamental purpose was the eradication of the Baha'i community. Of recent times, we've seen an upsurge and a reactivation of this society. It has been observed being more active in Iranian political circles and in religious circles as well. Given the policies that are in place as a result of the Golpe Ghani memorandum, that is that Baha'is be frustrated at every point possible, this government memorandum, this is of particular concern.
David, tell us, what is the current situation with regard to Baha'i youth being able to gain access to tertiary education?
Since 1979, when the Islamic Revolution took place, Baha'is have been specifically excluded from entering into any academic tertiary institution. Now, this is of particular concern because regardless of the marks of the results from entrance examinations that Baha'i youth and others have had, they have not been allowed to attend these organizations. The strategy used was to record the Baha'is as Muslim. Now, this is untrue. When the Baha'is requested that their allegiance to the Baha'i faith was corrected on their entrance examinations, this was not done. And as a consequence, they were prohibited because there was an error in their form. Now, of recent times, there has been a great upsurge in academic circles worldwide against this kind of practice. The freedom to education is a foundation principle for many countries throughout the world. This pressure has resulted in recent times where in 2006, some 300 Baha'i youth were enabled to enter into university and were accepted as university students. Now, whilst this is a very positive development, and clearly as a consequence of the international academic pressure that has been brought to bear. It's far from an appropriate result. We need much more. We need freedom to enter academic institutions.
Is it generally accepted that the situation of the Baha'is in Iran has deteriorated recently?
That's true, it has. And that's not just from the Baha'is' observation of the situation. There have been a number of international observers independently who have attested to this fact. Of significance is the United Nations Rapporteur on Religious Freedom, who observed that the situation for the Baha'is in Iran has severely deteriorated in recent times. A Lieutenant General, a gentleman by the name of Romero Delary, a Canadian senator who is an expert on genocide, released a statement recently, and he said that the international community should be prepared to protect the Baha'is in Iran from possible atrocities. He said he was deeply concerned that Iran's Baha'is are now being specifically targeted by a regime that has the means to carry out the most despicable of actions. The United Nations, in a special resolution of December the 16th, 2005, noted from the General Assembly an escalation and increased frequency of discrimination and other human rights violations against the Baha'is. International journalists have described recent moves in Iran as pre-genocidal cleansing and as a clear-cut program designed and state-sponsored to result in extinction of the Baha'i community. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, amongst other human rights organizations, have expressed their concern for the Baha'is in Iran, and they are monitoring the situation closely.
Thank you, David, for joining us on Baha'i On Air and for giving us an update on the most recent developments with regard to the persecution of the Baha'is in Iran.
It's been a pleasure.
Can you tell us how they were executed?
I don't know about my father, but my mother was by fire squad.
Firing squad?
Yes.
Wow.
And she was blindfolded in fire squad, and her body was thrown to the hole. There's a section they have for infidels, people, they said people who do not belong to God.
Infidels?
Yes. And her body was half buried. And in the beginning, the authorities actually denied that they had killed her. But later on, when we really insisted, mainly the Baha'i community insisted, they accepted and they show us the grave, but one condition, that we pay for each bullet 1,000 tuman.
So they denied killing her.
Yes.
They half buried her in the infidel section of the cemetery. And then they said that if you wanted to retrieve her body for a proper burial, you had to pay 1,000 tumans for every bullet that had been used to kill
That's
her.
right. The tuman is Iranian money.
What was that roughly in New Zealand dollars?
It was like $100.
$100. So for
Yes.
every bullet that killed her, the family
Has to pay $100. And there was absolutely no funeral for her. So later on, my uncle was there, and they tried to bury her again in the proper manner.
Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about your mother or your father?
It was really a shock for me, because I was not in Iran. Really, it was so difficult to feel so hopeless and helpless about what's going on in Iran. So it has direct effect on my life.
Absolutely, yeah.
And of course it has direct effect in the Baha'i community. And I think that as any country, there are people like my parents who were actually serving the community. They were very useful for the country. As an educator, as being such a woman in Iran, to be a scientist is rare to find. I know by the fact that even my mother in the prison will start teaching the young people who were in the prison. She taught them physics.
She taught them physics in prison?
In the prison. And after I know about the fact that when she was executed, the girls were really cried so hard and said, "Why did you take her away? She was our teacher." You know?
Right.
And there are women in the prison who wrote poems for her, and they were not Baha'is, they were non-Baha'is.
Oh.
So she was full of life. She didn't go to die, she went to live.
Yes.
But yet, I think because of her faith, she didn't want to deny her faith.
Was she asked to recant?
Yes, the matter of fact, if she did deny the faith, they might leave her free. But she didn't deny the faith. She stayed Baha'i. She wants to be a Baha'i. And I'm very glad she did that.
For us, it is sad and ironic that the Baha'is in Iran continue to be persecuted in this way, particularly since Baha'u'llah taught that religious truth is progressive, not absolute, and that all of the world's great prophets, including Krishna, Moses, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, and Baha'u'llah, reveal religious truth progressively. In this way, Baha'is recognize the divine origin of all of the world's great faiths and accept that the Baha'i faith has its roots in Islam in much the same way as Christianity has its roots in Judaism. Moreover, the Baha'i community freely acknowledges that the vast majority of Iranian citizens are peace-loving and tolerant, and that there are many voices in modern Iran that continue to work towards a more just and open society. We are grateful that the European Union, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and many other countries continue to support resolutions at the United Nations designed to ensure the complete emancipation of the Baha'i community in Iran. Baha'is do not seek any special privileges, but only the same human rights as other Iranian citizens. Baha'u'llah taught that the best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. For us, the emancipation of the Baha'i community in Iran is a question of justice. It is not about denigrating Islam or the people of Iran. We believe absolutely that all religions come from the same source and have the same ultimate purpose. We believe in the oneness of humanity and the need to eliminate all forms of prejudice, including religious prejudice. Thank you for watching our special episode on the persecution of the Baha'is in Iran, a matter that is very dear to the hearts of the New Zealand Baha'i community. I'm Bev Watson.
Buddhism,
Hurt not others as you yourself would find hurtful.
Judaism,
We should love our neighbors as we love ourselves.
Christianity,
Do unto others as you would want them to do unto you.
Islam,
Desire for your brother that which you desire for yourself.
Baha'i,
Blessed is he who prefers his brother before himself. In a world where religious difference is often the cause of dissension and strife, it's good to know there's a place where we can all be one.